welcome back to the Velvet Underworld channels. And after this video, I would really like to know your thoughts about these stories. Feel free to share it under the comment sections and where you come from so that we could connect to each other better through this channel. Thank you.
That night, in the fiercest storm the Louisiana coast had seen in 10 years, a gaunt woman was kneeling on the floor of a rotting fishing boat, both hands clenched tight in the collar of an unconscious man who weighed twice as much as she did. Blood from his forehead spread outward, mixing with rainwater and seawater, running in a pale red stream across the wooden planks. The waves slammed the little boat sideways as if they meant to overturn it at any moment, and each time the boat lurched, she slid toward the rail, nearly dragging them both down into the Black Sea, but she didn't let go. She bit down hard on her lip, forced every muscle in her thin arms to hold, and pulled. Then pulled one more time, then again, until the man's body lay fully across the floor of the boat, and she collapsed beside him, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Her name was Leora Ashford, 28 years old, unmarried, homeless, and without a single cent to her name. The weathered fishing boat beneath her feet was the only thing her father had left behind before the sea took him 14 years earlier. And the man lying unconscious there, the man she had just risked her life to drag up from $1 million yacht sinking in the middle of the storm. She had no idea who he was. She didn't know that he was Reed Calloway, a name that made the entire Gulf Coast shudder when people heard it. She knew even less that the yacht hadn't gone down because of the storm. Someone had paid a great deal of money to make sure Reed Calloway would never see the sun the next day. And Leora couldn't possibly have imagined that the decision to pull this stranger onto her broken-down boat would drag her into a world of gunfire, power, and secrets, but would also bring back to her something she had lost a very long time ago and believed she would never find again. 12 hours earlier, everything had begun. If this story touched you, please hit like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness still exists, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. 12 hours before the storm came crashing in, Leora Ashford opened her eyes inside a dilapidated wooden shack at the edge of the marsh, while the sky was still not fully light. The weak glow of an oil lamp on the table cast a small pool of light, just enough for her to see the old water stains spreading across the ceiling, where the tin roof had been punctured since last storm season, and she still hadn't had the money to patch it. She lay still for a moment, listening to the early wind slipping through the window frame with no glass, carrying the smell of marsh mud mixed with sea salt, a smell so familiar that if one day she no longer caught it in the air, she would think she had died. Leora sat up, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and then her eyes came to rest on a small photograph taped to the wall with a strip of yellowing adhesive. In the picture, a little girl with pale curls was smiling, her cheeks round and soft, her eyes exactly like Leora's, Bree, her daughter. Every morning when she woke, the first thing Leora did was look at that photograph, as if to remind herself that there was still a reason to step outside this shack. She rose and went into the kitchen. The wooden shelf was nearly bare, holding only a can of beans that had been opened the day before, and half a bag of rice worn down almost to the bottom. She didn't eat breakfast. She was used to that. Leora pulled on her old coat, the shoulders rubbed thin with wear, and stepped outside just as the eastern sky began to glow with a faint orange line across the marsh water. The fishing boat lay tilted near the bank, most of its paint peeled away, the wood dark in places and faded in others from years of rain and sun. The engine at the stern rusted through, and forever giving off a rough, choking cough each time it started. She pushed the boat out onto the water, climbed in, and yanked the starter cord 3 times before the engine finally turned over. The boat shuddered forward into the marsh in the first light of day, and Leora cast her net in the place her father had once taught her, where fresh water from the marsh met the salt water from the bay, where in the old days the nets had come up silver with fish. But when she hauled the net back 20 minutes later, it was almost empty. Only a few small fish no bigger than a hand, not enough to sell, not even enough for a decent meal. Leora sat in the middle of the boat, staring at the wet net slumped across the floorboards, and without meaning to, she thought of her father, not in the form of a sentence or some grand lesson. She remembered him through an image, sharp down to the smallest detail, as though it had happened only yesterday. Leora had been 11 then, sitting at the bow of the boat, watching her father dive into the water in the middle of a sudden squall to pull old Mr. Henley, a fisherman from the village, out of an overturned boat. The waves weren't enormous, but they were dangerous enough, and when her father managed to drag Mr. Henley into their boat, Leora saw a long gash running from his wrist, nearly to his elbow, where the rope had sliced into his skin. The wound bled for the rest of the week. Her father wrapped his arm in old cloth and still went out on the water every day as though nothing had happened. Mr. Henley came to thank him, and her father only nodded before going back to mending his net. When the neighbors asked why he had risked his life like that, he didn't answer. But that night, when it was only the two of them by the fire, Leora asked in a quiet voice, "Why didn't you let somebody else save Mr. Henley?" Walt Ashford looked at his daughter and sat in silence for a long moment, then said in a calm voice, as if he were talking about the weather, "There was nobody else, daughter. That was all." He didn't explain any further. He didn't turn it into a lesson. He never mentioned it again. But Leora remembered. She remembered because 3 years later, when she was 14, the sea took her father in the very same way he had once thrown himself forward to save someone else. A summer storm came in faster than the forecast had promised. Her father said he would be home before it arrived, but he didn't come home. Leora stood at the edge of the marsh all night, her feet sunk in mud, rain lashing her face, her eyes fixed on the black water, waiting to see the light of the little boat. That light never appeared. They found her father's boat 3 days later, overturned 7 miles from shore. Her father's body was never found, and from that night on, Leora lived alone with the boat her father had left behind, with the shack he had built with his own hands, and with the single sentence she kept from him the way someone might guard an invisible family heirloom. There was nobody else, daughter. The sea wasn't the only thing that had ever stolen everything from Leora. 6 years earlier, when she was 22, she had believed she had finally found something to lean on. Neil Dutton entered her life on a rainy afternoon at the fish market, when she was trying to sell the last meager catch of the day. He smiled, helped her carry a crate of fish to the truck, then told her that a woman like her shouldn't have to do heavy work alone. At the time, Leora believed him. She believed because she needed to believe, because she had lived alone too long since her father died, and because Neil's smile looked like a promise that she would never have to be lonely again. They were married 6 months later. At first, Neil was kind. He repaired the roof, bought her a new stove, and every evening asked if she needed anything. But that kindness didn't last. It began with words, with small cutting remarks that Leora told herself she was probably overthinking. Then came the shouting. Then came the punches. The first time Neil hit her, Leora sat in the bathroom for 3 hours, both arms wrapped around her stomach, where Bree was growing inside her. She wanted to leave right then, but she looked down at her rounded belly and thought that a child needed a father. That was the mistake she paid for over 4 long years. 4 years of silence, 4 years of hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, 4 years of telling Bree that Mommy had fallen down the stairs, until one night, when Bree was 3 years old, Neil got drunk and threw a glass at the wall right beside the little girl's head. Bree screamed in terror, and something inside Leora finally broke. Not broken by weakness, but broken by the sudden understanding that if she stayed even one more day, she would lose her daughter in a way worse than losing her father. She picked Bree up and ran into the night, carrying nothing but a bag of clothes and an old cell phone. But Neil's family had money. They had lawyers. And in court, Leora was only a woman with no stable job, no home, no property, living in a shabby shack beside the marsh. The judge gave Bree's custody to Neil on the grounds of the child's best interest. Leora remembered standing outside the courthouse that day under a blazing sun, and she didn't cry. She only stood there staring down at her empty hands for a long time, as if she were trying to understand how people could take a child away from the mother who had endured everything to protect her. Now the only thing Leora still had was a 15-minute phone call every Saturday night. Neil allowed that, not because he was kind, but because his lawyer advised him to appear cooperative. Every week, Leora sat on the shack's front step, dialed the number, and waited. When Bree's voice came through the phone, clear and sweet, Leora smiled, and that smile was real. She asked her daughter what she had eaten that day, whether she had drawn any new pictures, whether she had slept well. But every call always ended too quickly, and after the line went dead, Leora sat still for a very long time, her hand still holding the phone against her ear, as if she held it there long enough, the warmth of her daughter's voice wouldn't fade away. Even carrying all those wounds inside her, Leora didn't become a bitter woman. Every morning she still stopped by Boyd Raines's shack, the 70-year-old fisherman who lived a few hundred steps away, to help him mend his nets because his hands shook too badly to do it himself. Every afternoon she still gave 1/3 of her meager catch to Colette, the 80-year-old widow who lived at the far end of the settlement, even on days when Leora herself had nothing to eat for supper. Boyd would often sit and watch her doing those things, then shake his head, his voice low and a little rough with age. That girl gives away even the things she doesn't have. That afternoon, when Leora pulled her fishing boat back to shore after a long day on the marsh, she looked up at the sky and saw enormous black clouds rolling together along the horizon. The wind began to blow harder, carrying the heavy scent of rain and the sharp taste of salt. She looked down at the fish basket by her feet. Empty. Another day with nothing. Leora stood there, her hair whipping loose in the wind, and did the math in her head. If she had no fish to sell, she wouldn't have money to top up her phone. And if she didn't have money to top up her phone, then this Saturday night she wouldn't be able to call Bree, 1 week without hearing her daughter's voice. For anyone else, that might have been only a small inconvenience. But for Leora, it was the one thing that kept her from collapsing. Leora made the decision before she had time to think it all the way through. She turned her back on the path leading home to the shack and moved quickly down the sand toward the fishing boat tied at the wooden dock. The wind was already far stronger than it had been only minutes earlier, coming in violent bursts that bent the line of palms along the shore as if they were about to be ripped from the earth. Above her, the black clouds had swallowed the last of the sunset, turning everything into a heavy ash-gray world. Leora untied the boat, and her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She was shaking from hunger, from exhaustion, from a whole day out on the marsh, without eating anything except half a can of food early that morning. Even so, she shoved the boat down to the water's edge, climbed in, and yanked the starter cord on the old engine. It coughed and sputtered twice before catching, spitting out a thin stream of black smoke that disappeared into the wind. She hadn't even cleared the dock before she heard Boyd's voice behind her. The old man stood on shore, one hand gripping a wooden post, the other lifted high, waving for her to come back. "Leora, the storm's coming. Are you crazy? Turn around now!" Boyd's voice was torn to pieces by the wind, reaching her only in fragments, like a whisper buried inside the sound of the rising surf. Leora heard him. She heard every word clearly, but she didn't turn back. She thought of Bree's voice on the phone every Saturday night, of the question, "Mama, when are you coming to get me?" that she could never answer honestly. Then she thought of this coming Saturday night, of the phone lying silent because there was no money to add minutes, and of Bree sitting there waiting for a call that would never come. That thought hurt more than any storm. The boat pulled away from the dock, gliding through the shallow water near shore, before it began to meet the first waves of the ocean in its fury. Leora gripped the tiller tightly, her eyes narrowed against the dark ahead. Her father had once taught her that ocean waves were like breathing, that they rose and fell with a rhythm, and that if she could read the sea's breathing, it would never swallow her whole. She used that lesson now, steering the boat through the gap between two rising swells, then pushing the engine harder when the water briefly dropped, before the next wall of surf came rushing in. But the farther she moved from shore, the more savage the storm became. The waves were no longer ripples of water. They had become moving walls, higher than her head, crashing down with enough force to shake the boat like a leaf caught in floodwater. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid sheets that lashed straight across her face, as if someone were hurling bucket after bucket of freezing water at her without stopping. Thunder roared overhead, and every flash of lightning turned the sea into a sheet of blinding white for a single instant, before darkness swallowed it all again. Leora cast her net into the deep water beyond the coral reef, where she knew heavy waves sometimes drove schools of fish up from the bottom toward the surface. She waited. The rain lashed, the wind screamed, the boat pitched and rolled, and she waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Both her hands clung to the net rope, her fingers numb with cold, her nails biting into her palms, but she couldn't feel the pain. When she hauled the net back in, the weight of the water nearly threw her forward. But as the catch rose out of the sea, Leora saw what she had seen too many times in recent weeks. Nothing. The net was empty, holding only a few strips of seaweed and one small jellyfish tangled in the old mesh. Leora stood there in the middle of the storm, her hands still wrapped around the empty net, rain running down her face, and she felt something heavier than seawater pressing on her chest. It wasn't despair. Leora had lived with despair for too long for it to still break her. It was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that belongs to someone who has tried too hard and received too little, and still won't allow herself to stop. She pulled the net in, turned the tiller, and pointed the bow toward the faint blinking village lights barely visible through the rain. It was time to go back. This storm wasn't meant for her tonight, or at least, that was what she thought. Barely 100 miles away, while Leora was struggling with an empty net in the middle of the storm off the Louisiana coast, another man was sitting in the dark inside a room on the top floor of an old building in the French Quarter of New Orleans. The room's overhead light was off. Only the glow from a small desk lamp lit one corner, just enough to reveal the man's hand slowly turning a glass of whiskey across the dark wooden table. The ice in the glass had nearly melted, but he didn't drink. He only turned it, slowly, steadily, as if the motion itself helped him think. Drake Mercer was 42 years old, and in all those 42 years, he had learned that power didn't belong to the strongest man. It belonged to the man who knew how to wait the longest. 10 years earlier, Drake and Reed Calloway had once sat at the same table, dividing up shipping routes along the Gulf Coast, building an empire together out of swamp, mud, and darkness. They weren't friends, because men like them didn't have friends, but they were allies. And in the underworld, an ally could sometimes be worth more than blood. But Reed had made one mistake Drake never forgave. Reed had principles. He refused to touch women and children, refused the deals Drake considered necessary, and refused to look the other way when Drake wanted to expand into territories Reed believed were the final line that shouldn't be crossed. To Drake, principles were a luxury for weak men, and weak men didn't deserve a seat at his table. The split began quietly, then exploded. Drake broke away, taking half of Reed's men with him, seizing a third of the territory, and from that moment on, the two men became enemies. But Drake wasn't in a hurry. He waited. He waited for the exact moment when Reed would let down his guard. And tonight, after 3 years of patience, that moment had come. The phone on the table gave a soft vibration. Drake picked it up and said nothing. He only listened. The voice on the other end of the line was low and precise. The device has been placed in the engine room. Once the yacht is far enough from the coast, we'll activate it. No one survives at that distance. Drake remained silent for a few seconds after the man had finished speaking, as if he were savoring the echo of every word. Then he lifted the whiskey to his lips, took a small sip, and said only one sentence, his voice so flat it sounded like he was commenting on the weather. "I don't pay for no one survives. I pay for Calloway doesn't survive. Make sure of that." Then he ended the call and set the phone back down on the table gently, without a sound. The room sank back into silence, broken only by the faint touch of melting ice against the side of the glass as Drake turned it one more time. He looked out the window. Outside, the New Orleans sky was still clear, and the street lamps cast a pale gold glow onto the damp street below. The storm was making landfall along the southern coast, hundreds of miles away, exactly where Reed Calloway's yacht was cutting through the night. Drake rose to his feet and walked to the window, one hand in his pocket, the other still holding the whiskey glass. He looked down at the city and spoke softly. His voice meant for no one at all, only for the darkness in front of him. "Goodbye, Calloway." Then he drained the glass, set it on the windowsill, and turned away into the dark. And meanwhile, off the Louisiana coast, Leora Ashford was turning her boat back toward shore, without knowing that less than 2 nautical miles from her, a multi-million-dollar yacht was carrying a timed bomb, and the man inside it had only minutes left before everything exploded. Leora was gripping the tiller, steering her boat toward the dim, scattered lights of the fishing village, when a bolt of lightning ripped across the sky, so blinding and violent that she had to shut her eyes for a split second. But in that brief instant when the light washed over the sea, her eyes caught the shape of something that didn't belong to the ocean. Far off to her right, perhaps less than 2 nautical miles away, an enormous object was listing sharply to one side. Its outline burned against the bright sky for an instant, before vanishing again, when darkness slammed back down. Leora blinked, unsure of what she had just seen. Then a second flash of lightning came, longer this time, and she saw it clearly. A yacht, 10 times the size of her fishing boat, its white hull still gleaming even under the rain, but leaning hard to port at an angle no vessel could hold for long and still stay afloat. Black smoke was rolling up from the stern, torn into pieces by the wind, but still thick enough to be seen in the lightning and fire. Small bursts of orange flame flickered near the stern, beaten down by the rain and then rising again, as though something inside was burning that water couldn't put out. Leora let go of the tiller for 1 second, instinct forcing her half to her feet in the middle of the boat as she tried to see through the black curtain of rain. Then she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind, because the storm was roaring without pause, swallowing every other sound. But then it came again, and this time she heard it clearly. A man's voice, low but weak, almost desperate, stretched by the wind into more of a groan than a cry. Help, somebody. A third flash of lightning split the sky, and this time Leora saw him. A man was clinging to the starboard railing of the listing yacht, the lower half of his body already swallowed by seawater surging across the deck. Even from this distance, in the brief, violent light of the storm, she could still see the dark red streak across his forehead, blood mixing with rain, and running down his pale face. One hand clung to the railing, the other hung limp at his side, as if he had no strength left or his shoulder had been injured. He was going down with the yacht, and if no one reached him within the next few minutes, the sea would swallow him the way it had swallowed her father 14 years earlier. The thought struck Leora like a slap. Her father. The boat that never came back. She had stood on the shore at 14 years old, waiting until morning, then waiting another day, then another week, before finally accepting that the sea had kept him forever. And now the storm was reaching for another life right in front of her eyes. Leora fell into a moment of hesitation, and she hated herself for having it. She thought of Bree, her daughter, 5 years old, asleep in a house Leora wasn't allowed to enter, growing up without her mother beside her. If Leora turned the boat toward that sinking yacht and never made it back, Bree would lose her mother forever. No one would fight to win her back. No one would call her every Saturday night. Bree would grow up in Neil Dutton's house and never know how fiercely her mother had loved her. Leora's fingers tightened around the tiller, her eyes fixed on the village lights. Home, safety, survival, for Bree. But then the image of her father rose in her mind. Not her father on the boat that vanished into the storm, but her father long before that, hauling a fisherman out of the water while rope tore his palms open until they bled. And when Leora had asked why he hadn't let somebody else save the man, he had answered in the calmest voice she had ever heard. There was nobody else, daughter. There was nobody else. Leora looked out at the black sea, at the yacht sinking lower by the second, at the shadow of the man hanging weakly to the railing in the dark between flashes of lightning. She looked one last time toward the village lights. Then she turned the tiller. The little fishing boat veered away from the path toward shore, its bow shifting slowly until it pointed straight into the heart of the storm, toward the dying yacht. Leora Ashford didn't know that the man clinging to that railing was Reed Calloway. She didn't know that someone had tried to kill him that night. She knew only one thing, that out there, a man was dying, and there was nobody else but her. The fishing boat drove through the towering waves, and each time it climbed a crest and dropped into the trough below, Leora felt as though her entire insides were being lifted and hurled down all at once. She held the tiller with both hands, her eyes never leaving the listing yacht ahead of her. The closer she came, the more clearly she could see that the massive vessel was dying. It was leaning hard to port, almost 45 degrees, the bow already flooded nearly up to the main deck, while the stern was still pouring out black smoke threaded with bursts of flame that the rain beat down only to have them flare up again. Something inside had exploded, tearing open the lower hull, and seawater was rushing in through the breach with such force that Leora could hear it pouring even above the scream of the storm. When her fishing boat came close enough, she could see the difference between them in a way that felt almost absurd. Her boat was tiny, old, paint peeled away, like a toy someone had accidentally dropped beside a collapsing building. But she didn't have time to think about that. She killed the engine and used a brief lull between two waves to steer the boat up against the yacht's starboard side, where the railing still rose above the water. She grabbed the thickest rope in her boat, wrapped one end around the net post at the bow of the fishing boat, then threw the other end upward, looped it around the yacht's metal railing, and knotted it tight. Now the two boats were joined by that single rope, and every time a wave struck, it pulled taut with a shriek as though it might snap at any second. Leora didn't allow herself another thought. She caught hold of the yacht's railing and climbed up. The deck was tilted so sharply that she almost had to crawl instead of walk. Her feet slid across the slick wooden surface, and at once she realized she was stepping into a world entirely different from anything she had ever known. Shards of glass from the cabin windows were scattered everywhere, glittering under the lightning like diamonds strewn across the floor. Luxurious furnishings drifted in the seawater, already rising to her ankles. Leather chairs, crystal glasses, carved decorative wood, all of it floating in the black, freezing water. A crystal chandelier had fallen from the ceiling and now lay on its side across the floor, still glimmering whenever lightning flashed outside. Leora clung to the doorframe, then to the stair rail, then to anything her hands could find, dragging herself toward the starboard side where she had seen the figure from a distance. The seawater deepened with every second, from her ankles to her knees, icy and heavy, dragging at her legs with every step. Then she saw him. The man was gripping the railing with one hand, his right arm hanging limp at his side, the shoulder of his shirt dark, with blood mixing into the rain. His head sagged forward, and a long gash ran across his forehead, blood streaming down his face only to be thinned almost at once by the rain. His eyes were glazed, half open and half shut, and Leora couldn't tell whether he was still conscious or already unconscious, with only his body clinging to the railing out of pure instinct. She lunged toward him, slipped once on the slanted deck, her knee slamming into broken glass, but she didn't feel the pain. She seized his collar and shouted, "Look at me! Can you hear me?" He didn't answer. He only gave a faint groan. His eyes opened a little wider and looked at her as though they were looking straight through her. Leora pulled the rope she had brought with her free, wrapped it around his chest, and tied the knot as tightly as she could. She shoved her arm under his and began to drag him. He weighed twice as much as she did, his body limp and slick with water. Leora strained through each step, hauling him back up the slanted deck toward the starboard side where she had tied her fishing boat. Every step was a fight against gravity, against the water, against the slick deck beneath her feet. She had dragged him nearly to the starboard railing, close enough now that she could see her tiny fishing boat leaping wildly on the waves below, when everything exploded. The blast came from the engine room at the stern of the yacht, a deafening roar followed by a ball of orange fire tearing open the darkness. The force of the explosion slammed into Leora's back like a giant hand, hurling both her and the unconscious man over the railing. For one suspended instant, Leora felt herself hanging in the air, metal fragments flying all around her, heat striking the back of her neck, and then the black, freezing sea swallowed them both. The sea swallowed Leora like a giant hand, dragging her down into darkness. Cold. That was the first thing she felt. A cold so sharp it pierced through flesh, sliced into bone, and made her whole body seize in an instant. Then came the darkness. Not the darkness of night on the sea, where lightning still flashed now and then, but a total darkness, thick and absolute, without direction. She didn't know which way was up or which way was down. Her ears rang from the blast. Her eyes burned from the salt water, and her lungs were beginning to blaze from lack of air. Every survival instinct inside her screamed to swim upward, but she didn't know where upward was. Then her hand struck the rope she had tied around the man's chest before the explosion hit. It was still there, stretched tight and pulling in one direction. Leora grabbed hold of it, and in that moment, the rope became the only thing connecting her to life. She pulled herself along it in the darkness, hand over hand, until her fingers touched fabric. Then a shoulder, then the man's neck. He didn't move. His body hung heavy in the water, his head fallen forward, completely unconscious. Leora shoved one arm beneath his shoulder, locked his chin with her elbow to keep his face tilted upward, and then she began to kick. She kicked on instinct, on the memory her body had stored from the thousands of times she had swum in the marsh since childhood. Her father had thrown her into the water when she was 6 years old and told her that the sea would teach her to swim faster than anyone ever could. He had been right. Her lungs were about to burst when her head broke the surface. She dragged in a breath so deep it hurt, swallowed rainwater and seawater with it, but didn't care. Air. She needed air, and now she had it. But the man in her arms still wasn't breathing. Leora turned her head, searching for the fishing boat. The rope she had used to tie it to the yacht's railing had snapped, but the little boat was still drifting nearby, maybe 20 yards away, bobbing on the waves like a wooden duck in an enormous bathtub. She started swimming toward it, holding the man with one arm and stroking with the other. Waves kept crashing over her face, each swell dragging them both under before heaving them back up again. 20 yards became the longest distance Leora had ever swum in her life. When her hand struck the side of the boat, she wanted to cry with relief, but couldn't, because she knew the hardest part was only beginning. Pulling a man who weighed twice as much as she did out of the water and into a fishing boat. The first time, she strained with every ounce of strength she had, both hands gripping his collar, Her feet braced against the side of the boat for leverage, and pulled. She got the upper half of his body over the edge when a wave slammed into them, knocking them both back into the water again. The second time, she tried again. This time she looped the rope through the net post on the boat and used it like a pulley, dragging him up inch by inch. She got him as far as his chest before her hands slipped from sweat and seawater, and he slid back down again. She nearly let go. Her body had passed its limit long ago. Every muscle was trembling with exhaustion, and a voice in her mind whispered that she couldn't do it, that he was too heavy, that the sea wanted to keep him. But every time the thought of giving up rose inside her, she saw her father. Not her father drowning in the storm, but her father hauling a fisherman from the water, his hands split open and bleeding, his face calm. There was nobody else, daughter. The third time, Leora screamed into the storm, the sound swallowed by the wind, but it helped her pour everything she had left into her arms. She pulled, until the man's whole body lay fully across the floor of the boat, and she collapsed beside him, exactly as this story began. But he wasn't breathing. His chest didn't move. His lips had turned blue. Leora dropped to her knees beside him, placed both hands one over the other in the middle of his chest, and pushed down. Once, twice, 3 times. No response. She tipped his head back, pinched his nose shut, pressed her mouth to his, and breathed into him. His chest rose, then fell. She pressed on his chest again. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Still nothing. Rain lashed her back. Waves rocked the boat savagely, but Leora didn't stop. She pressed on his chest again, and again, and again, each time harder, each time more desperate. Then he coughed, one weak, ragged cough, and seawater spilled from his mouth. Then he coughed again, harder this time, his whole body jerking as his lungs fought to force the water out. He vomited seawater, then dragged in a trembling breath, short and painful, but it was a breath. He was breathing. Leora sank back onto the floor of the boat, both hands shaking violently, and realized that she too was gasping as though she herself had just been dragged up from the bottom of the sea. Leora didn't allow herself to rest. The man was breathing, weak and uneven, but breathing, and that meant she wasn't allowed to stop yet. She pulled him onto his side so whatever water remained in his lungs could drain out, then took the old coat she always kept in the stern of the boat. The coat faded by sun and wind, with the smell of fish worked so deeply into the fabric that it would never wash clean, and spread it over him. The coat was far too small for his body, covering only his chest and stomach. But it was all she had. She tore a strip of cloth from the roll of old netting in the corner of the boat, folded it into a thick pad, then pressed it hard against the gash on his forehead to stop the bleeding. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but she tied the cloth in place with a piece of fishing line, tight enough to hold it steady without pulling too hard. Then she stood, stepped back to the tiller, and started the old engine again. The motor coughed 3 times before catching, and Leora turned the bow toward shore. The journey back took nearly an hour, though the actual distance was probably only a few nautical miles. But the storm wouldn't let her travel in a straight line. The waves kept slamming sideways into the boat, forcing it off course, and Leora had to keep correcting, slipping through the gaps between each swell the way her father had taught her. Every few minutes she turned to look at the man lying on the floor of the boat, checking whether his chest was still rising. Each time she saw that faint movement still there, no matter how slight, she turned forward again and kept steering. Slowly, the storm began to tire before Leora did. The wind eased from a roar into a thin whistle. The rain changed from sheets lashing across her face into a slanting drift of fine drops. The waves were still high, but they no longer seemed determined to flip the boat over. And then, through the thinning veil of rain, Leora saw lights. Small, dim, flickering, but unmistakably lights. The lights of the fishing village, the place where she had lived her whole life, where her rotting shack was waiting, where Bree's photograph was still taped to the wall with that strip of yellowed tape. She guided the boat into the dock, killed the engine, and tied the rope to the wooden post with hands that were almost too numb from the cold to feel anything at all. Then came the hardest part, dragging the man onto shore. She couldn't clearly remember how she managed it. She only remembered sliding her arms under his shoulders, dragging him from the boat to the wooden dock, from the dock across the wet sand, from the sand along the narrow dirt path to the shack door. Every yard felt like a mile, and by the time she laid him on the only bed in the shack, her arms were shaking so badly she couldn't hold anything at all for several minutes. She laid him flat on his back on the bed, propped his head on the thin, flattened pillow, then began doing whatever she could. She lit the small wood stove in the corner of the shack to warm the room. She tore more strips from the old netting, dipped them in warm water, then cleaned the dried blood from his forehead and face. The gash on his forehead was deep but not too long, and the bleeding had already begun to clot. The wound in his shoulder was worse. The shirt ripped wide open to reveal a deep cut, possibly from a piece of metal thrown by the explosion. Leora cleaned it, then wrapped it tight with strips of cloth she cut from an old bedsheet. While she was wiping away blood and changing the bandages, her hand brushed against his shirt, and she realized at once that the fabric was unlike anything she had ever touched. Soft, smooth, thin but heavy in the hand. The kind of cloth she knew she would never be able to afford even if she worked her whole life. The watch on his wrist had a shattered face, but even broken, it still looked more expensive than everything inside her shack put together. Then, when she pushed back his sleeve to check for any other injuries, she saw the scars. Not new scars, but old ones long healed, faded but still visible. The kind of scars people didn't get from ordinary accidents. And on his wrist, just beneath the tendon, a small tattoo, plain, black ink, a shape Leora didn't recognize. She looked at the scars, looked at the tattoo, looked at the expensive, blood-stained clothes. And she knew this man wasn't a fisherman, wasn't a sailor, wasn't some ordinary traveler unlucky enough to be caught at sea. He was someone else, someone from a world she didn't belong to. But Leora didn't stop what she was doing. She changed the bandage on his forehead. When the blood soaked through, she pulled the only thin blanket she had over him. She lowered herself onto the cold wooden floor beside the bed and leaned her back against the wall, her eyes never leaving the man whose breathing was slowly becoming more even on her bed. To Leora, he wasn't a rich man, wasn't a dangerous man, wasn't a mystery waiting to be solved. He was only a human being who needed to be kept warm through the night, and she was the only one there. Reed Calloway opened his eyes and didn't recognize a single thing. The first thing he saw was the ceiling. Rough, rotting wood, warped in places so badly that light slipped through in a thin line, running along a crack. The smell came next, striking his senses without warning. Salted fish, damp wood smoke from a cooking fire, all of it woven together into a scent he hadn't breathed in anywhere he had been for the last 20 years. Instinct moved before thought. Before Reed could understand where he was or what had happened, his body reacted on its own. His eyes swept the room, measuring the space by the habit burned into his blood after 2 decades living in a world where anyone might want him dead. Door, to the left, thin wood, one kick and it would give way. Window, to the right, small, but big enough to crawl through if necessary. No weapon in sight, no suspicious sound, only the distant sound of the sea and the low whistle of wind through the cracks. He tried to sit up, and pain hit him instantly. His left shoulder felt as though someone had driven a bar of hot iron through it. His head throbbed from his forehead all the way to the back of his neck, and his whole body ached as if he had been beaten with iron rods for hours. He looked down and saw his chest and shoulder wrapped in rough strips of cloth. Not medical bandages, but the kind of fabric cut from an old sheet or a fishing net, yet tied with careful hands, tight enough and no tighter. Someone had bandaged him. Someone had put him in this bed. Someone had kept him alive through the night. And Reed didn't know who that someone was. In his world, that meant danger. He tried to piece together the last fragments of memory before he had blacked out. The yacht, the explosion, seawater, darkness, then nothing. Someone had tried to kill him on that yacht, of that he was certain, and now he was in a place he didn't know. Wounded, unarmed, without his phone, with no one around that he recognized. Every possibility was dangerous. Maybe someone had saved him to demand a ransom. Maybe someone was holding him to hand him over to an enemy. Maybe this was a more careful trap than the bomb on the yacht had been. The sound of light footsteps outside the door made his whole body go rigid at once. The thin wooden door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was thin, her dark brown hair tied back in a hurried knot, dressed in faded old clothes, and in her hands she carried a steaming bowl of something. She came to the side of the bed, set the bowl down on a small table against the wall, then looked at him. Her eyes held no fear, no nervousness, only the weariness of someone who had stayed awake all night, and the faintest trace of relief that he was awake. "You're up," she said, her voice calm. "You've been here since last night. The wound in your shoulder is pretty deep, but the bleeding stopped. Your head was cut open. I bandaged it." Reed looked at her, And his expression wasn't the look of a man who had just had his life saved. It was the cold, sharp look of a man assessing a threat. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice rough from seawater and exhaustion, but still hard and clear. The woman blinked, clearly not understanding the question. "Who do you work for?" Reed asked again, his eyes never leaving her. "Who told you to bring me here?" For 1 second she stood still. Then Reed saw something change in her face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't worry. It was anger. It flashed in her eyes, quick and sharp, like the lightning over the sea the night before. "No one sent me," she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge it hadn't had before. "I found you clinging to the railing of a yacht that was about to sink in the middle of the storm. I climbed aboard and dragged you down. Then it exploded. I pulled you out of the sea when you were almost dead, drove a boat back here for an hour through the storm, hauled you into this shack, bandaged you, and sat up all night on the floor watching over you." She stopped and looked straight into his eyes. "And that bowl of porridge is the last meal I have." Reed said nothing, but his eyes still didn't change. He had lived too long in a world where every kindness had a price, where every smile hid a blade. He couldn't trust it at once. He didn't know how to trust it. And Leora saw that. She looked at him for another moment, then let out a quiet breath. Not the sigh of someone tired, but the breath of someone deciding not to waste any more strength. "Eat or don't, that's up to you," she said, her voice no longer angry, only carrying a flat, calm indifference. "When you can leave, leave." Then she turned away, walked to the door, and closed the thin wooden panel behind her. She didn't slam it. She only shut it softly, just enough to be heard. Reed sat on the bed, looking at the closed door, then at the steaming bowl of porridge on the table, and for the first time in many years, Reed Calloway didn't know how he was supposed to respond. The door closed, and Reed sat alone in the silence. The bowl of porridge was still steaming on the small wooden table beside the bed, the scent of overcooked rice mixed with a trace of sea salt drifting softly through the damp air. Reed didn't touch it right away. He sat still, his eyes moving slowly across the shack once again, but this time not to find an exit or assess a threat. This time he was truly looking, and what he saw made him stop. The wooden kitchen shelf against the wall held only a dented can of food and a small bag of rice worn almost down to nothing. There was no meat, no vegetables, nothing to suggest that the person living here had enough to eat through tomorrow. The clothes hanging from a line stretched across the corner of the room were only 2 or 3 sets, faded and worn thin at the elbows and knees, the kind of wear that came from being used over and over for years, not months. The wooden floor was warped, with gaps wide enough in places to see the dirt beneath, and on the wall opposite the bed, right at the eye level of someone lying down, there was a small photograph, a picture of a little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old when it was taken, with round eyes and light brown hair, grinning wide at the camera. The photograph had been taped to the wall with a strip of yellowed tape, the edges curling slightly from the damp, but it had been placed there carefully, exactly where the person lying in the bed would see it first when opening their eyes each morning, and last before closing them each night. Reed looked at the photograph, then at the bowl of porridge, then at the nearly empty kitchen shelf, and he understood. This bowl of porridge wasn't part of a meal she had shared with him. It was the whole meal. She had cooked the last of the rice, poured it into that bowl, and brought it to a stranger whose name she didn't even know. A man who had responded by asking her in a cold voice who had sent her. That realization touched something deep inside Reed, something he had believed died a long time ago. He remembered. Not the explosion, not the yacht, not the storm, but a night more than 20 years earlier, when he was 12 years old, curled beneath a bridge in Treme in New Orleans. His father had disappeared 3 days before, without a word, without a dollar, leaving behind only an empty rented room and the unpaid rent bill the landlord had come demanding that morning. Reed had wandered the streets for 3 days, sleeping under the bridge, drinking water from a public fountain in the park, and hungry to the point that he no longer even felt hunger, only a cold, hollow space inside his stomach that he thought would never be filled again. Then an old woman selling food passed by. Every morning she pushed her small cart at the street corner selling sandwiches, and when she saw Reed sitting under the bridge, his eyes sunken, his clothes filthy, she asked nothing. She didn't ask who he was, where his parents were, or why he was there. She simply took a sandwich from the cart, walked over, placed it in his hand, then returned to her cart, and kept going. Not a word, not waiting for thanks, not waiting for him to explain. Reed had eaten that sandwich in 3 minutes and remembered it for 24 years. Not because it had tasted good, but because it was the last time in his life anyone had given him anything without wanting something in return. After that, everything he received came with terms. Loyalty in exchange for protection, money in exchange for power, obedience in exchange for life. 24 years, and not one person had given Reed Calloway anything without attaching a price to it, until this bowl of porridge. Reed looked at the bowl again, then he picked it up and ate. Slowly, spoonful by spoonful. The porridge was thin, only rice and salt. No meat, no vegetables. But it was warm, and Reed couldn't remember the last time he had eaten anything that felt that warm. That afternoon, when the sun had begun to break through the clouds left behind by the storm and spread a pale gold light across the marsh, Reed tried to stand. His left shoulder still throbbed, his head still stabbed with pain whenever he moved too quickly, but his legs were steady enough to carry him. He pushed open the thin wooden door and stepped outside. Leora was sitting on the porch, her back to him, both hands moving quickly as she mended a torn fishing net. She didn't turn when she heard the door. She didn't look at him. She didn't say a word, as if he didn't exist. Reed stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her back, looking at the calloused hands, threading fishing line through each square of net with the practiced skill of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Then he spoke, his voice still rough but much softer than it had been that morning. The porridge was good. Thank you. Leora didn't turn around. Her hands kept moving through the net, the rhythm unchanged. You're welcome, she said. Only 2 words. Not warm, not cold, only calm. But she didn't tell him to leave, and Reed didn't go back inside. He stood there, leaning lightly against the doorframe, and the two of them stayed silent together in the sound of the distant sea. Neither said anything more, but that silence was entirely different from the tense silence of the morning. It was lighter, as if they had both agreed on something without needing to say it aloud. About an hour later, footsteps sounded on the dirt path. Boyd Raines appeared at the head of the trail leading to the shack, his gait slow but his old eyes quick as they swept over Reed standing in the doorway. He looked at the strange man with the bandage on his head and his arm hanging in front of him, then looked over at Leora. Leora spoke simply. He got caught out at sea last night. I pulled him out. Boyd studied Reed for a few seconds longer, his gaze full of suspicion he didn't bother to hide, though he didn't voice it. Then he nodded slowly, turned to Leora, asked if she needed anything, and when she shook her head, he quietly turned away. But before disappearing behind the line of trees, he glanced back at Reed one more time, and that look said more clearly than words ever could that he was watching. By the second day, Reed was no longer lying in bed. He sat in the doorway of the shack from early morning on, his back against the wooden frame, and watched. He watched Leora drag the boat out into the marsh while the sky was still only beginning to pale, her brown hair tied back in a hurried knot, her body thin and slight, yet her footsteps on the sand firm and certain, like someone who had walked that path 1,000 times. He watched her return near midday, with a catch that held only a dozen or so small fish, enough to fit in the cup of 2 hands. And he watched her divide that catch into 3 parts. One portion she carried to the far end of the settlement for Colette, the old widow Reed had seen sitting on her small porch since morning. One portion she left on Boyd's porch while the old man was away, and the last portion, the smallest of the 3, she carried into the kitchen. Reed said nothing. He only watched, and he wondered when the last time had been that he had met anyone who lived like this. Someone who was nearly starving and still gave away her food to others before thinking of herself. That afternoon, while Leora sat on the porch mending nets, Reed asked about the photograph on the wall. He didn't ask directly. He only said, "The little girl in the picture. How old is she now?" Leora's hand paused for 1 beat over the netting, then continued. 5, she said. Her name is Bree. She said more after that, not because Reed had asked, but as though once the name had been spoken, everything behind it came with it. She told him that Bree was living with her father, that she wasn't allowed to live with her daughter, that every week she was given only 15 minutes on the phone on Saturday night. She told it all in a calm voice, without trembling, without choking on the words, without sounding in any way like someone asking for pity. She spoke as if she were talking about the weather, as if that pain had become part of the rhythm of her breathing and no longer needed to be emphasized. It was that calm that shook Reed more than any tears could have. Then she told him about Neil, briefly, without details, only enough for Reed to understand. Kind at first, then abusive. 4 years of endurance, escape, loss of custody, because the court decided she didn't have the financial means to raise her child. Leora finished speaking and went on, mending the net as though nothing had happened. But Reed couldn't go on as though nothing had happened. He sat still, his jaw clenched tight, and a quiet anger began to rise inside him. The kind of anger he knew well, because it was the same anger he felt every time he saw a man using strength to crush someone weaker. In Reed's world, he had very few principles, but the greatest of them, the one he would kill to protect, was that women and children were never to be touched. And Neil Dutton had done both. Reed said nothing about that anger. He only stared out at the sea and tightened his hand into a fist. That afternoon, the sky remained calm, but the sea did not. The tide rose without warning, water from the marsh rushing inland faster than usual, flooding across the sand and beginning to lick at the foot of the shack. Leora saw it first. She was out on the porch when the water had already risen to her ankles, and the fishing boat tied at the dock was being shoved and dragged by the surge. The rope stretched so tight it looked ready to snap. She ran out onto the beach, wading through water already up to her knees, trying to drag the boat higher onto shore. But the boat was heavy, and the water was rising too fast. Reed saw her struggling from the doorway, and before he had time to think about the wound in his shoulder or the pain in his head, he was already running outside. The cold water reached his thighs, and his left shoulder sent a sharp stab of pain through him when he grabbed the rope and pulled with Leora. The two of them didn't say a word. They only pulled, stepped, until the boat rested high enough on the sand to be safe. Then they ran back to the shack and lifted everything they could onto higher ground, propping the stove and the food up on the bed so the floodwater wouldn't reach them. When the tide finally pulled back that evening, the two of them sat on the porch, gasping for breath, their clothes soaked through, and for the first time since Reed had woken up in that shack, they were on the same side. Not rescuer and rescued, not homeowner and stranger, but two people standing together against something larger than either one of them. On the third day, Leora handed Reed a spool of fishing line and a torn section of net. "Sitting around is a waste," she said simply. "I'm teaching you how to mend nets." Reed took the line in hands accustomed to holding very different things heavier, more dangerous, and tried to thread it through the net the way Leora showed him. But his fingers were too rough, too stiff, and the thin line kept slipping free every time he tried to tie the knot. On the third attempt, he managed to tangle an entire section of the net into a mess, and Leora looked at that hopeless knot, then looked at him. Then she laughed, softly, only the slightest lift at the corner of her mouth, and a small breath of amusement through her nose. But it was the first time Reed had seen her smile, and he stopped. He stopped completely, his hand still holding the line, his eyes on her, and something inside his chest shifted, just a little, like a door that had been closed too long suddenly cracking open by the smallest margin. That night, the two of them sat beside the small fire inside the shack. The flames danced, throwing shadows across the wooden walls, and outside the sea had gone still again after the high tide that afternoon. Reed looked into the fire and asked, without looking at her, "Aren't you angry at life? You lost your father, lost your daughter, lost everything, and you're still sitting here mending nets and sharing fish with your neighbors?" Leora was silent for a moment. Then she answered, her voice as calm as ever, but carrying something behind it that Reed couldn't name. "Anger doesn't feed me, and it doesn't bring Bree back." That night, after the fire in the stove had burned down to red coals and Reed lay on the wooden floor beside the bed under the thin blanket Leora had shared with him, she sat on the step outside the shack and dialed a phone number. It was Saturday. Reed didn't sleep. He lay facing the wall, eyes open, and listened. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered on the other end, and then a child's voice broke through, clear and eager enough to cut through the shack's thin wooden walls, as if the little girl were standing right there in the room. "Mama!" Reed heard Leora draw in one short breath, and when she spoke, her voice was warmer than at any moment he had heard in the last 3 days. Warm in the way only a mother speaking to her child can be. "Bree, sweetheart, are you okay? What did you do today?" The little girl talked fast, and in the scattered way children do, about the neighbor's cat, about a picture her teacher had praised, about the strawberry ice cream she had eaten at school. Leora listened, and even though Reed couldn't see her face, he knew she was smiling because her voice changed when she answered, gentler, slower, as if she were trying to stretch every second of the call. Then Bree asked the question. The little girl's voice suddenly grew smaller, No longer excited, but carrying something children shouldn't have to know at that age, longing. "Mama, when are you coming to get me?" Silence. Reed counted 3 beats of his own heart in that silence. Then Leora spoke, and her voice was still warm, still tender, but now there was a thin crack running underneath it that she was trying to hide with all the strength she had left. "Soon, sweetheart, soon." She hadn't had time to say anything more when another voice cut in, a man's voice, blunt and cold. And Reed knew at once it had to be Neil Dutton. "Time's up." Then came the sound of the line going dead. No goodbye. No, I love you. Nothing but the flat, steady tone. Reed lay motionless, his eyes still open, and listened. He heard that Leora didn't hang up. She didn't lower the phone. He heard the dead tone continue for another 10 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe half a minute. And he knew she was sitting there on the step outside, the old phone pressed to her ear, her eyes probably fixed on the Black Sea, holding on to the last warmth of her daughter's voice even though the line had been dead for a long time. Reed clenched both hands beneath the blanket. His nails bit so deeply into his palms that it hurt, but he didn't loosen them. He clenched harder, and the anger he had kept buried since the afternoon before, when he heard Leora speak of Neil, now rose with even greater force. Not a hot anger, but a cold one, the kind of anger Reed knew was the most dangerous, because it didn't flare and die. It burned low and steady until it destroyed something. He didn't say a word. He only lay there, facing the wall, fists tight. And for the first time in a very long while, Reed Calloway felt something hot and wet rise at the corner of his eye before he could stop it. The next day, the 4th day since Reed had come to Leora's shack, everything began to change. That afternoon, while Leora was mending nets out on the porch, and Reed sat on the doorstep looking toward the narrow dirt road leading into the village, a black pickup truck drove slowly past. Very slowly. Slower than normal for a road in a small fishing village where there was nothing worth staring at. Leora didn't notice. She kept her head bent over the net, her hands moving in a steady rhythm, but Reed noticed. He watched the truck through narrowed eyes, taking in the license plate, taking in the way the driver turned his head toward Leora's shack, and taking in that it wasn't a vehicle belonging to the fishing village. Tinted windows, new tires, a body too clean for a marsh settlement. Someone was looking for him. That night Reed didn't sleep, and this time it wasn't because of Bree's phone call. He lay still on the floor, eyes open, thinking, if Drake's men found this place, Leora would be in danger. This woman didn't know who he was, didn't know that his world even existed, and if that world touched her, it would crush her without hesitation. Early on the 5th morning, after Leora had gone out to the marsh, there came a knock at the shack door. Reed opened it and found a man standing on the porch. He looked like a fisherman. Old shirt, faded khaki pants, a sun cap pulled low. But Reed recognized him instantly. The shoes were too new, the hands too clean, and the way he stood, weight angled slightly forward, shoulders straight, eyes sweeping the area before settling on the man in front of him. That was the stance of someone used to carrying a gun, not pulling nets. "Boss," Jessup Crane said in a low voice, his eyes red from lack of sleep and maybe from something else as well. "We thought you were dead." Reed pulled Jessup down toward the water, far enough that no one would hear. Jessup reported quickly. Drake Mercer was behind the explosion. The bomb had been planted in the yacht's engine room. The 2 guards on board had both been killed. Drake was taking territory, killing the men still loyal to Reed, and believed Reed had sunk to the bottom of the sea. The war was escalating. Reed listened, nodded, and spoke briefly. "Put people around this village, quietly. No one knows I'm here." He stopped, looking out toward the marsh where the outline of Leora's little fishing boat was fading deeper into the early morning mist. "And no one touches her. Anyone." Leora pulled her boat back to the dock at midday and saw the strange man standing outside her shack. She stopped on the sand, still holding the rope tied to the boat, and watched. He wore an old shirt and faded khaki pants, and at first glance he looked like any fisherman in the village. But Leora had spent her whole life among fishermen, and she knew when a man wasn't one of them. His hands were too clean. No calluses, no cuts from fishing line, no fingernails stained yellow by salt water. His shoes looked new, the soles not yet worn down by sand and coral rock. And the way he stood, shoulders straight, weight tilted slightly forward, eyes sweeping the area before settling on the person in front of him. That was the stance of a man used to carrying something heavy at his side, not hauling nets over his shoulder. Leora tied the boat to the post, stepped up from the shore, and walked straight toward the shack. Reed was standing in the doorway, and when he saw Leora, something in his eyes shifted in the smallest way, just enough for her to know he was trying to hide something. The strange man had moved back, almost disappearing behind the corner of the shack, but Leora had already seen him. She stopped in front of Reed, looked straight into his eyes, and asked, "Who are you really?" Reed didn't answer right away. He looked at her, and Leora realized this was the first time in 5 days that his face held neither coldness nor caution, but something closer to helplessness, as if he were standing in front of a question for which every answer was wrong. "Leora," he said, his voice low, "I can't tell you everything, but I'll tell you enough." He said he wasn't a businessman, wasn't a tourist, wasn't any of the things an ordinary person would expect to meet out on the water at night. He said he was a dangerous man, that there were people trying to kill him, and that his being here was putting her at risk she didn't deserve to carry. He said each sentence in an even voice, not trying to soften it, not trying to excuse it. Leora listened. She listened to every word, and with each one, she felt something inside her change. Not fear. Leora had lived through too much to be afraid of a man, simply because he said he was dangerous. She had lived with Neil Dutton for 4 years, and Neil had never once said he was dangerous. He had simply proven it with his fists, night after night. No, what Leora felt wasn't fear. It was anger. It rose from the pit of her stomach, hot and sharp. And when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It hardened like the sea before a storm. "For 3 days you stayed in my house. You ate the only bowl of porridge I had. You slept on my bed while I sat on the floor. I taught you how to mend nets. I told you about my daughter." She stopped, drew in one breath, and never took her eyes off his. "And you're the kind of man who can get me killed just by being near me?" She pointed to the door. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't tremble. She only raised her hand toward the thin wooden door, her finger straight and steady. "Go." Reed stood still. For the last 20 years he had been threatened, betrayed, shot at, hunted. But no one had ever sent him away like this. Not because they were afraid of him, not because they hated him, but because they were angry that he had deceived the trust she had given him. And Reed realized that hurt more than any bullet ever had. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, no explanation, no defense. Then he turned away, met Jessup at the corner of the shack, and the two of them disappeared down the narrow dirt road leading out of the village without looking back. The shack was empty. Leora stood in the middle of the small room, her hand still raised toward the closed door, then slowly lowered it. She looked around. The bed where Reed had slept for 5 nights, the blanket still folded the way he had left it, still holding warmth when she laid her hand on it. The patch of floor where he had sat mending nets the day before. A few clumsy strands of fishing line still scattered across the wood. She sat down on the edge of the bed, both hands resting on her lap, and did nothing at all. Boyd stopped by that afternoon. He stood in the doorway, looked into the empty shack, looked at Leora sitting motionless, and asked in a rough, gentle voice, "You all right, girl?" "I'm fine," Leora said. They both knew she wasn't. 2 weeks passed. Leora returned to the old rhythm of her life, going out to the marsh, hauling nets, sharing fish, mending nets, calling Bree on Saturday night. Everything looked the same as it had before the storm came, but something had changed. She found herself looking out at the sea for longer stretches, not waiting for fish, but waiting for something she didn't want to name. And one evening, while cleaning up in the kitchen, she found the mug. The chipped mug Reed had used to drink coffee every morning during the 3 days he had been there. She had washed it clean the day he left, but never put it away. It was still sitting on the shelf beside her own cup. Leora picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, then set it back exactly where it had been. Word spread that Reed Calloway was still alive in the 2nd week after he left the fishing village. A spy inside Reed's organization, a man who had sold himself to Drake Mercer before the yacht explosion, overheard Jessup's order to place watchers around a small village on the edge of the Louisiana marsh. That piece of information took only a few hours to reach Drake, and Drake didn't need more than that to put the picture together. Calloway had survived. Someone in the fishing village had saved him, and Drake needed to know who. Strangers began appearing in the village over the following days. Not loudly, not in any way meant to draw attention, Just unfamiliar faces the villagers had never seen before, sitting over coffee at the little place near the head of the settlement, walking along the beach at unusual hours, asking harmless-sounding questions about the weather and the fishing season. Boyd Rains noticed before anyone else. He had lived in that village for 70 years and knew every face, every dog, every boat. When he saw two strange men pass Leora's shack twice in one afternoon, he knew something was wrong. He came by Leora's place that evening, his voice lower than usual. "Strangers were asking about you," he said, "asking whether you live alone or if anyone's with you. Be careful." Leora nodded, but didn't think much of it. She had grown used to living without fear, because when a person has already lost almost everything, fear loses most of its power too. She was wrong. 3 nights after Boyd's warning, Leora came back late from the water. It was fully dark, and the dirt path from the dock to her shack was lit only by a thin wash of moonlight slipping through the clouds. She was walking quickly, the fish basket swaying lightly at her hip, when 3 figures stepped out from the trees along the road. She stopped. They didn't speak right away. The man in the middle was nearly a head taller than she was, wearing a dark jacket, his hands in his pockets, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and slow in the way of someone who didn't need to raise it to make himself feared. "Where's Calloway?" Leora looked at him, then at the 2 men on either side. She didn't know where Reed was. Since the day she told him to leave, she hadn't heard a word from him, didn't know where he had gone, didn't know whether he even remembered this shack anymore. But even if she had known, she wouldn't have told them. Not because she wanted to protect Reed, but because Leora Ashford wasn't the kind of woman who yielded to men who blocked her path in the dark. "I don't know who Calloway is," she said, her voice calm. The man looked at her for a moment, then gave a nod to the other 2. They didn't hit her. They went straight down to the dock. Leora ran after them, but she reached it too late. The first sound she heard was wood breaking. They were using a crowbar on the body of her fishing boat, blow after blow, steady, unhurried, as though they were carrying out some ordinary job. The hull cracked, then split, and rotten wood flew off in splinters. They smashed the engine, the sides, the bow, every piece of it. Every part her father had built with his own hands more than 20 years before. When they stopped and disappeared into the darkness, the boat was nothing but a pile of shattered wood on the sand. Leora stood there looking at it. Then she sank to her knees. Her knees hit the wet sand, and her hand reached out for a splintered piece of wood. It was small, no bigger than her palm, the blue paint nearly gone, but she could still make out the faint shape of a word written there by hand. Leora. Her father had painted her name on the side of the boat when she was born, in white paint, the letters uneven, because his hand had trembled while he wrote, and for more than 20 years Leora had touched that name every day before going out on the water, a habit she had never once abandoned. Now it lay in her hand on a broken splinter of wood. Leora didn't cry. She only sat there on the sand beside the wreckage, holding the piece of wood with her name on it, and Boyd found her there when he came running to the dock after hearing the noise. He sat down beside her, said nothing, only rested his old hand on her shoulder, and the 2 of them sat in silence. The next morning, Leora's phone rang. She answered and heard Neil Dutton's voice, the voice she would have recognized even in the worst dream of her life. "I hear you've gotten mixed up with dangerous people, Leora," Neil said, not even trying to hide the satisfaction in his voice. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. We're filing to terminate visitation completely. You don't deserve to be anywhere near Bree." The line went dead. Leora stood in the middle of the shack, the phone still in her hand, and felt everything collapse at once. Her boat destroyed at the dock, her fishing livelihood gone, strangers who could return at any moment, and now Bree. The last thing, the only thing that had still been keeping her upright, was being torn from her hands too. While Leora stood in the middle of the shack, with the phone in her hand, and the feeling that everything was collapsing, less than 100 miles away, Jessup Crane was standing in front of Reed Calloway, in the penthouse, on the 30th floor, in downtown New Orleans, and telling him everything. Jessup gave him every detail, the spy leaking information, Drake's men finding the village, the 3 men stopping Leora on her way home, the fishing boat smashed to pieces, and finally, Neil Dutton using all of it to cut off her right to see her daughter. When Jessup finished, Reed didn't react. He stood perfectly still, his back to Jessup, his face turned toward the wall of glass looking down over the city. New Orleans stretched out below, streetlights pale gold, traffic moving like lines of glowing ants, and somewhere far off the Mississippi curved dark and heavy beneath the night sky. Jessup had worked for Reed for 12 years, long enough to know that Reed Calloway's silence was more dangerous than anyone else's rage. When Reed shouted, it meant he was controlling the situation. When Reed went silent, it meant someone was about to lose everything. Jessup stood still and waited. Reed looked down at the city through the thick glass, and he saw everything he owned. This penthouse, the expensive furniture he had never really noticed, the bottles on the shelf he couldn't remember anyone buying, the car parked downstairs that he rarely drove himself. He had everything: money, power, territory, loyal men, frightened enemies. In 24 years, from a boy sleeping beneath a bridge to the man standing on the 30th floor, he had built all of it with will and with blood. But tonight, standing in the middle of everything he possessed, Reed wasn't thinking about his empire. He was thinking about the smell of salted fish, about the sound of waves touching the edge of the marsh after midnight, about firelight dancing on rotting wooden walls, about calloused hands threading fishing line through a torn net with a steady rhythm, about a woman sitting on the shack porch, her back straight, her eyes on the sea, never complaining, even though life had taken nearly everything from her. 3 days. 3 days he had lain in that shack, sleeping on the cold wooden floor, eating plain rice porridge cooked from someone else's last handful of rice, learning to mend nets with hands that had only ever known how to hold dangerous things. The only 3 days in the last 24 years when he hadn't been Reed Calloway, the man people bowed to or ran from when they heard his name. In those 3 days, he had only been a wounded man given a bowl of porridge when he was hungry, and he wanted to go back there. Not because of debt, not because of obligation, but because it was the only place he had ever felt real. Reed turned to look at Jessup. "Where's Drake?" Jessup answered at once. "The old warehouse at Algiers Point. He's been using it as a temporary headquarters since he took the Southern Territory." Reed nodded. "Call everyone in. Tonight." The meeting took place in a room without windows, in the basement of an abandoned restaurant in the warehouse district. Reed arrived first. He sat at the head of the table, a glass of water in front of him that he never touched, and waited. When Drake Mercer walked in, he stopped in the doorway. Reed knew that was the moment Drake understood. Not because the room was full of Reed's people. Not because the 2 guards at the door had taken Drake's weapons before letting him in, but because Reed was sitting there calm, back straight, his eyes on Drake without anger, without hurry, exactly the way a man looks at something that ended a long time ago and is only being cleared away today. Drake realized he had lost before he ever stepped into that room. Maybe he had lost the night the bomb went off on the yacht and Reed didn't die. Maybe he had lost 3 years earlier, the moment he chose betrayal. Reed didn't say much. He said only enough for Drake to understand that the territory was gone, the men were gone, the money was gone, and there was no road back. He spoke in an even voice, without threat, without triumph, and that flat calm was more frightening than any threat could have been. When Reed stood up and walked out of the room, Drake was still sitting in the chair, alone. The room was empty, the glass of water on the table still full, and Drake Mercer, the man who had paid to destroy another man's yacht, the man who had sent people to smash the only fishing boat a poor fisherman had left, now sat alone in a room with no windows, and understood that he had nothing anymore. No territory, no men, no power, no place to go home to. The man who destroyed other people's boats had finally lost every boat of his own. The old gray pickup truck was parked at the head of the dirt road, leading into the fishing village early that morning, while the fog from the marsh still clung low over the water. Reed Calloway stepped out of the truck alone, wearing a plain t-shirt and old jeans. No bodyguards, no Jessup, no one else. He walked down the familiar dirt road, past Boyd's shack, past Colette's house, and down to the strip of sand where the dock sat. He saw Leora before she saw him. She was sitting on the sand beside the pile of broken wood that, only a few weeks earlier, had been her father's fishing boat. Around her, the splintered pieces had been sorted into little groups, anything still usable on one side, everything shattered beyond repair on the other. Her hands were trying to fit 2 pieces of wood together, tying them with rope, but the wood had split along the grain and couldn't be joined that way. It was a hopeless thing to do, and Leora knew that. But she kept doing it, because it was the only thing she could do when everything else had gone beyond her reach. Reed walked over and stopped a few steps away. She heard his footsteps in the sand and looked up. Her eyes met his, and for one moment neither of them said a word. Then Reed sat down beside her on the sand, picked up a piece of wood from the wreckage, and began trying to fit it to the piece she was holding. No words, no explanation for why he was there. He simply sat down and did the work with her. They kept fitting pieces together in silence for a long while before Leora spoke, her eyes not on him. "This happened because of you." Reed didn't deny it. He nodded slowly, his hand still holding the piece of wood. "I know. I'll fix it." Leora turned to look at him, and her eyes no longer held the anger they had the day she sent him away. But they weren't warm either. They were the eyes of someone so tired she no longer had the strength left for any sharp emotion. "You can't fix everything," she said. Reed looked at her, and this time his hand brushed hers by accident over the piece of wood between them. They both paused for 1 second, then kept going as if nothing had happened. "No," he said, "but I can fix this." Reed didn't buy her a new boat. He knew Leora would refuse, because she was the kind of woman who would rather go hungry than accept something she felt she hadn't earned with her own hands. So he did it another way. He used his influence, not Mafia influence, but the relationships he had with officials along the coast, to push the fisheries authorities into investigating the illegal industrial fishing vessels operating off the marsh waters. It was a problem the fishermen in the village had been protesting for years, but no one had listened, because they were too small and too poor to have a voice. But when Reed Calloway wanted someone to listen, they listened. Within a few weeks, the industrial boats were forced out of those waters, and slowly the fish began to return. Not only Leora, but the whole fishing village benefited. And no one knew why things had suddenly changed. As for the boat, Reed found an old boat builder in Homa, a man who had been building wooden boats by hand for 50 years. He brought him all the broken pieces of wood that Leora had so carefully sorted on the sand, together with only one instruction: preserve as much of the original wood as possible. Not a new boat. The old boat restored from the very boards her father had chosen and shaped with his own hands more than 20 years earlier. And above all, preserve the piece of wood with the handwritten name. When the boat was brought back to the village one morning, Leora stood at the dock and looked at it. The boat looked different, stronger, the sides reinforced, the engine new in place of the old coughing motor she had known before, and a fresh coat of paint spread evenly across the wood. But on the starboard side near the bow, one old piece of wood had been left untouched, not repainted, not replaced. On it, the uneven handwriting, white paint yellowed by time, still clearly spelled a single name: Leora. She stepped forward and laid her hand on that piece of wood. Her fingers moved slowly over each letter her father had painted on the day she was born, letters shaky with the nervous joy of a father holding his daughter for the first time. That piece of wood had been with her for more than 28 years, through thousands of mornings going out on the water, through storms, through sun, through nights when she sat in the boat, looking at the stars and thinking of her father. It had been smashed apart by men she didn't even know. And now it was here, on a boat brought back to life, still intact, still carrying her name. Leora Ashford, who hadn't cried when she lost her father, hadn't cried when her husband beat her, hadn't cried when she lost custody of her daughter, hadn't cried when the boat was smashed to pieces, cried for the first time. She stood there, her hand resting on her father's writing, her eyes watching everything blur, and the tears slipped down her cheeks in silence. No sobbing, no shaking, only tears falling onto the old wood and soaking into the grain as though they had waited a very long time to fall. Reed stood at a distance on the sand and watched her. He didn't step closer. He knew that moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to Leora and her father, and he was only the man who had found a way to bring them back together through that small piece of wood. Reed provided the lawyer, but Leora was the one who stood in court herself. She wouldn't agree to let someone else fight this battle for her. This was her daughter, her Bree, the child she had endured 4 years of abuse to protect, and if she had to stand before a judge and say that she was worthy of being a mother, then she would say it with her own mouth. The lawyer Reed found was one of the best in Louisiana, but his role wasn't to speak for Leora. His role was to bring in what she hadn't had the first time: evidence. Medical records from a clinic in Terrebonne Parish showed 4 emergency visits by Leora over the course of 3 years: cracked ribs, bruising to the face and arms, 1 broken finger. Each time, she had told the doctors she had fallen, but the doctor had made private notes in the file that the placement and shape of the injuries didn't match ordinary household accidents. Witnesses were called too. Colette, the widow living at the far end of the old settlement where Leora and Neil had once lived, testified that she often heard shouting from their house at night, and that one time she saw Leora sitting out on the porch at 3 in the morning, arms wrapped around her stomach, face swollen, eyes staring straight into the dark. Neil Dutton sat on the other side of the courtroom and went paler with every piece of evidence brought forward. His lawyer tried to push back, but medical records don't lie, and Colette's voice, trembling with age, was still clear in every word as she spoke. Neil watched everything collapse, the wall his family had built out of money and connections to hide the truth, and there was nothing he could do except sit there and watch it happen. But the moment that changed everything didn't come from the lawyer or the evidence. It came from Bree. The judge allowed the child into the courtroom, and Bree walked in with small, uncertain steps, her hand clutching the hem of her shirt. The room was so quiet that the sound of the little girl's sandals on the floor could be heard. The judge asked Bree in the gentlest voice possible, "Who do you want to live with?" Bree stood in the middle of the room. She looked to the right, where Neil was sitting, his face trying to shape itself into a smile but managing only the kind of strained expression that even a 5-year-old child could recognize. Then she looked to the left, where Leora was sitting, both hands resting on her lap, eyes on her daughter, not calling out, not waving, not saying a word, only looking at her with the same eyes Bree had seen every Saturday night through a phone screen for so many months. Bree ran to Leora, no hesitation, no looking back. She simply ran on her small legs across the polished wooden floor of the courtroom until she flung herself into her mother's arms. Neil watched his daughter run away from him, and something on his face broke apart. Not anger, not shame, but the slow and painful realization that he had lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered, not because the court had taken it away, but because he himself had pushed it away long before this day. The judge granted custody of Bree to Leora. The days after the hearing passed in a feeling Leora didn't know how to name. She filled out forms, signed papers, and waited. Then came the day she was allowed to pick Bree up. Leora stood outside the gate of the kindergarten, one hand clenched around the strap of her small bag, and waited. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned, a white blouse she saved only for important occasions, and she had arrived 15 minutes before dismissal because she simply couldn't bear to wait any longer. When the gate opened and the children began pouring out into the yard, Leora saw Bree at once. Light brown hair, wide round eyes, a little backpack with butterflies on it. Bree looked around the yard, searching, and then her eyes found her mother, and Bree ran. She ran with all the strength in her 5-year-old legs, her backpack bouncing against her back, her arms spread wide, and when she reached her, Leora dropped to her knees just in time to catch her daughter in her arms. Bree wrapped both little arms around her mother's neck so tightly Leora could barely breathe. But she didn't want the girl to let go. Leora pressed her face into her daughter's hair, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and sun-warmed skin, and she couldn't say a single word. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because no words in this world were large enough for that moment. She only held her. Held her tight. Held her for a long time. Held her until Bree whispered into her ear in a clear, small voice, "You really came to get me, Mama?" And Leora nodded, eyes squeezed shut, tears running into her daughter's hair. Across the street, a short distance from the school gate, Reed Calloway stood with his back against the old pickup truck, both hands in his pockets, and watched. Jessup stood beside him, his phone in his hand but not looking at the screen. He looked at Reed, looked at the way his boss was watching the woman holding the little girl across the street, and Jessup said softly, "I've worked for you for 12 years. I've never seen you look at anyone like that." Reed didn't answer. He only stood there leaning against the truck, watching Leora hold Bree, and on the face of the man the entire Gulf Coast feared. Something softened in a way Jessup had never seen before. After the court hearing, Reed didn't go looking for Leora. He didn't call, didn't come to the village, didn't send word through Jessup. He waited, not because he didn't want to come, but because he knew Leora needed time with Bree, without the shadow of his world standing between them. She had just gotten her daughter back after so many months apart, and the last thing she needed was a Mafia boss standing at her doorway. So Reed waited. He went back to New Orleans, sat in the penthouse on the 30th floor, handled business, gave orders, met with people, and every evening he stood before the wall of glass looking down at the city, while in his mind all he could see was the marsh at sunset. On the 5th day after the hearing, Jessup received a call from an unknown number. It was Leora. She asked only one question. her voice as calm as ever. "Is Reed okay?" Jessup passed the message on to Reed, and Reed looked at Jessup for a long moment before speaking. "Tell her I'm okay." Then he paused, and asked her if she'd mind if I came by. Leora didn't mind. Reed came to the fishing village the following afternoon, in the same old pickup truck, wearing the same t-shirt and jeans, alone. He didn't bring gifts, didn't bring money, didn't carry anything at all from his world. He only came, knocked on the shack door, and when Leora opened it, he said, "I just wanted to stop by." Leora looked at him, nodded, and stepped aside to let him in. Bree was sitting on the floor, drawing with colored pencils, and when the little girl looked up and saw the stranger, she tucked herself behind her mother's leg, staring at Reed with wide eyes that were both curious and shy. Reed sat down on the porch in front of the shack, and Leora sat beside him. The two of them looked out at the sea. Bree played in the yard, shy at first, but after a while she forgot about the stranger and went back to drawing in the sand with a stick. They talked, not about anything grand. Leora said the fish had come back to the marsh, that Boyd had pulled in the fullest net he had seen in half a year, and smiled so brightly she thought the old man must have had sunstroke. Reed said the drive back here took 4 hours if traffic didn't clog up near Baton Rouge, and today he had been stuck for nearly 1. Leora asked Bree whether she liked the new school, and when she told Reed that Bree had just lost her first molar and proudly showed it to everyone in class, Reed almost smiled. Almost, because Reed Calloway wasn't a man who smiled often, but one corner of his mouth lifted a little, and Leora saw it. Reed left before dark. He said goodbye to Leora, waved to Bree, and drove away. The next week he came back, then the week after that. Then he started coming more often, sometimes with only a few days in between, sometimes 2 days in a row. He never stayed overnight, never brought anything expensive, and never said a single word about work or the world beyond the fishing village. He only came, sat on the porch, and talked about fish and weather and the small, ordinary things that had no place in his life anywhere else. Bree began to grow used to his presence. She didn't hide behind her mother's leg anymore, and one afternoon, while Reed was sitting on the porch, Bree walked up and placed a crayon drawing in his hand, then ran off without saying a word. The picture showed 3 people standing side by side, one tall, one shorter, and one very small in the middle. Reed looked at that drawing for a long time. Then, one evening, after Bree was asleep and Leora was sitting outside on the porch looking up at the stars, the little girl had asked, before drifting off in a sleepy but serious voice, "Mama, is Uncle Reed coming tomorrow?" Leora hadn't known what to say. She told her, "I'm not sure, sweetheart." But the next morning Reed came, and Bree ran out into the yard shouting, "Uncle Reed!" and grabbed his hand to pull him down to the sand to see the crab she had just found. Reed let a 5-year-old child drag him away without resistance, and Leora stood on the porch watching them, and she realized that something had changed, though she couldn't say exactly when it had happened. That night, after Bree was asleep, Leora and Reed sat together on the shack's front step. The sea shimmered black under the moonlight in the distance, and the soft sound of waves touching the edge of the marsh made the kind of music Leora had listened to all her life. But tonight it sounded different because someone was sitting beside her. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, without looking at him. "The boat, the lawyer, the fishing waters, all of it. Why?" Reed was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow, as though he were saying something he had thought about for a long time but had never said aloud before. "Because there was nobody else." Leora turned to look at him, and in that moment, she understood those 4 words. That wasn't an answer Reed had made up on his own. It was the sentence her father had spoken. The sentence she had told Reed one night beside the fire when he asked why her father had saved people even when he was hurt. "There was nobody else, daughter." Reed had listened. In those 3 days in the rotting shack, eating plain porridge and sleeping on the cold wooden floor, he had listened to everything she said, remembered every word, and now he was using her father's own sentence to answer her. Not because he was trying to impress her, but because he truly understood what it meant. Leora looked at Reed, and Reed looked at Leora, and neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. The sound of the waves filled the silence between them, and that silence wasn't empty. It was full. Several months had passed since that fateful night of the storm. Leora's once crumbling shack by the marsh wasn't the same anymore. Not a mansion, because Leora had refused that immediately when Reed brought it up. She told him she didn't need a big house. She only needed a place where Bree could hear the waves every night before falling asleep, the way she herself had heard them all her life. So the house remained in the same place, by the shore, only a few steps from the dock, but the roof had been rebuilt strong and tight so it no longer leaked. The wooden floor had been replaced while keeping the old design, and now the kitchen always held enough rice, enough salt, enough food for a mother and daughter. Boyd still came by every morning, and now he didn't stop in only to check on Leora but to see Bree too, because the little girl had quickly turned him into an unwilling storyteller every afternoon. He would sit on the porch mending nets, Bree beside him asking one question after another about fish and the sea and boats, and he would answer every one in that soft, rough voice of his while his old eyes shone. On the stretch of sand in front of the house, one Saturday afternoon, there was a sight that if anyone from the Gulf Coast underworld had seen it, they wouldn't have believed their own eyes. Reed Calloway, the name that made the whole coast shudder, was crouching in the sand, his jeans muddy to the knees, both hands building a sand wall, while Bree gave orders in the most serious voice a 5-year-old could possibly make. "Uncle Bear, this side's gotta be taller. The waves are coming." Uncle Bear, that was the nickname Bree had given Reed the month before, because she said Uncle Reed was big and quiet like the bear in the story her teacher had read to the class. Reed didn't object to the nickname. He didn't object to anything Bree said, and Jessup had seen it often enough to know that his boss, the man grown adults lowered their heads to when speaking with him, was completely helpless in front of a 5-year-old little girl with eyes like her mother's. Reed built the sand wall higher just as Bree instructed, and when a small wave rushed in and knocked down one corner of the castle, Bree squealed and burst into laughter, grabbing Reed's hand and dragging him back, then pulling him forward again to keep building. Leora sat on the porch, the restored fishing boat resting quietly at the dock, and watched her daughter playing with the man she had pulled from the bottom of the sea only a few months earlier. The late afternoon sunlight spilled gold across the marsh, and the gentle wind carried the scent of salt and wet sand, the same scent Leora had breathed for 28 years. Only today it felt different, because today it was woven together with Bree's laughter and the sight of Reed kneeling in the sand building a castle for her daughter. When evening lowered itself over the shore, and Bree ran inside to wash her hands, Reed stepped up onto the porch and sat down beside Leora. The two of them looked out at the sea, the water reflecting a sky shifting from orange into violet, and the sea was calm. So calm it was hard to believe these were the very waters that had once tried to kill them both on that storm night. Then Reed did something he had never done before. He reached out and took Leora's hand, gently, slowly, as though he were asking permission instead of acting. His hand was large, rough, marked by scars, closing around her smaller, calloused hand. Leora didn't pull away. She looked down at their hands joined together, then rested her head against his shoulder. They sat there, two people who had once lost everything, sitting side by side on the porch of a small house by the sea, watching the sun sink beneath the horizon while inside the house Bree was singing a song she had learned at school, her clear little voice drifting through the open door. The sea was calm. The evening light was soft. The child was laughing, and two people who had gone through storms, who had lost, fallen, and risen again, had finally found each other. Leora never told anyone about those 3 days in the shack with Reed. She never spoke of the storm night, of the sinking yacht, of the bowl of plain porridge made from the last of her rice, of the man who had distrusted her and then slowly let his guard down, of the afternoon mending nets, when she laughed for the first time in so long. Some stories don't need to be told again. They only need to be lived. And sometimes, in the cruelest storm, life isn't testing us. Life is simply placing the right person in the right boat at the right moment so they can find each other. This story reminds us that kindness never truly disappears. It can be buried beneath grief, beneath exhaustion, beneath a life full of injustice, but it is still there, waiting for the right moment to shine. Leora had nothing but a rotting boat and a heart that refused to give up, and that alone changed her life forever. If this story touched you, please hit like so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that kindness still exists in the world. And subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more meaningful stories every day. We would love to know how this story made you feel. In real life, have you ever experienced a moment when someone's kindness completely changed a day, a month, or even your whole life? Share it in the comments below. We're always listening, because every one of your stories deserves to be told. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.